ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that Jason had never expected to find himself pulled back into Drew's orbit with such force, especially after years of emotional distance, fractured trust, and separate lives carved by circumstance. Yet the moment he learned that Drew's collapse had been caused by poison, not stress, not exhaustion, not one of the countless external threats that once stalked Port Charles, something inside him shifted. It was not brotherly affection in its purest form. That bond had been chipped away long ago. Instead, it was a more profound instinct, a sense of unfinished responsibility, the deep-rooted need to protect someone who had shared part of his identity even when fate forced them apart. Drew was still blood, still family, still a reflection of a life Jason once thought he understood. And whoever had tried to kill him had underestimated the one person who never allowed himself to walk away from. Injustice. That realization ignited a quiet fire inside Jason, a fire that only grew stronger the more he investigated, the more he uncovered, and the more he recognized that the poisoning was far more calculated than anyone around him wanted to admit. As Jason examined Drew's final known movements, his interactions, his emotional strain, and the people who had the means to manipulate his environment, he began to notice a pattern, a subtle one, easily dismissed by anyone less attuned to deception. But Jason felt it. The shift in behavior, the careful construction of a narrative that made Drew appear unstable, the way certain individuals hovered at just the right distance. Close enough to observe, but not close enough to draw suspicion. It was a pattern that unsettled Jason's instincts, awakening the darker skills he had once relied upon to navigate enemy territory. At first, he believed he was chasing shadows. Then he realized the shadows all pointed toward the same place, the same name, the same delicate facade, Willow. It was a suspicion Jason never wanted to entertain. Willow had always carried a softness that seemed immune to corruption, a moral compass that guided her even in her darkest hours. But the more Jason watched her, the more he sensed something tightening around her, something she was trying desperately to control. He noticed the trembling restraint in her hands when Drew's name surfaced. The evasive explanations she repeated like memorized lines. The distance she inserted between herself and the situation, as if she feared getting too close to her own truth. Willow's silence no longer felt like grief. It felt like fear, the kind of fear that came from knowing too much or doing something that could not be undone. And as Jason tracked each of her small behavioral shifts, he began to question whether the image she projected was a mask crafted out of necessity, protecting a secret that could tear open the entire investigation. The emotional fracture between Jason and Drew made the investigation more painful, but it also made Jason more objective. He knew he wasn't acting out of some idealized loyalty toward his brother. He was acting because the situation was wrong, unnatural, orchestrated. Drew had been targeted deliberately. The poison was not random. The opportunity was precise. And when Jason considered the people who had the access and motive to manipulate Drew's daily environment, Willow's name kept resurfacing, like a tide refusing to recede. He did not want to accept the possibility, but the weight of evidence, subtle, quiet, yet persistent, kept pushing him closer to a truth he dreaded uncovering. He revisited every moment Willow and Drew had shared in recent weeks, analyzing how her interactions aligned with the timeline of the poisoning. The closer he looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. Willow had been the last to see Drew on several occasions, yet had offered explanations that felt oddly rehearsed. She had insisted she wanted to help him manage his stress, yet seemed strangely relieved whenever he withdrew from the people who cared for him. Most disturbingly, Willow had access to medications and supplements that could have been tampered with without anyone noticing. Her proximity made her an ideal suspect. Her temperament made her the least suspected. And her silence made her the most dangerous. The realization struck Jason like a physical blow, forcing him to confront a monstrous possibility. Willow might have been involved knowingly, or worse, she might have been manipulated by someone else and become an unwitting weapon in a larger scheme. Either version was catastrophic. Jason sensed that the poisoning was not isolated. It was part of a deeper strategy to destabilize alliances, shift power, and fracture relationships that once formed the backbone of Port Charles. Drew's collapse was not the final objective. It was the first domino. And as Jason followed the lines of consequence, he saw how easily the situation could spiral into something irreversible. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Willow was at the center of the storm. Not because she wanted to be, but because someone had placed her there, positioned her carefully like a pawn disguised as a queen. Jason knew that Willow's vulnerability made her susceptible to influence, especially if the person exploiting her understood her fears, her insecurities, or the pressure she placed upon herself to maintain a perfect moral image. If someone had weaponized that used her kindness as a shield to mask a far darker agenda, then Drew had never stood a chance. As Jason pieced together the emerging picture, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a mixture of dread and determination. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about preventing a disaster that had only just begun. Willow's involvement, whether deliberate or coerced, meant that the threat extended beyond Drew. If she remained in play, unaware of the damage she was causing, or unwilling to admit her role, more people could fall. More alliances could fracture. More lives could unravel. Jason understood that confronting Willow would not be simple. She was fragile in ways that made any confrontation potentially destructive. But he also knew that his hesitation could cost lives. The truth had to be extracted no matter how deeply buried or painfully intertwined with personal history. And as he prepared himself for the storm that was coming, Jason realized that this investigation was about more than justice for Drew. It was about stepping back into a world he thought he had escaped, a world where secrets were lethal, and every decision carried the weight of life and death. The moment Jason allowed himself to suspect Willow fully, the narrative of the poisoning shifted. It became more intricate, more dangerous, more unpredictable. And in the echoes of that realization, he sensed the beginning of a disaster, one that would test everything he thought he understood about loyalty, truth, and the fragile boundaries of human morality. Because if Willow truly held the key to Drew's poisoning, then Jason was not just uncovering a crime, he was uncovering a tragedy that would shatter Port Charles. Jason had reached a point where silence was no longer tolerable, where every unanswered question gnawed at him like a wound that refused to close. The poisoning, the unraveling of Drew's mental state, the strange shifts in Willow's behavior, none of it aligned, unless someone, somewhere, was holding back a crucial piece of the truth. And the person who had positioned herself too neatly outside the line of fire, yet close enough to know far more than she admitted, was Alexis Davis. Jason understood Alexis better than most. She was brilliant, perceptive, and painfully aware of the consequences of mishandling dangerous secrets, which was exactly why her restraint had become a red flag. Alexis did not withhold information unless she believed the truth itself was combustible. Jason approached her not as an ally, not as a friend, but as a man who had been pushed to the edge of a nightmare he never asked to enter. He demanded answers not with threats, not with violence, but with the heavy, unmovable force of someone who had already decided he would do anything to protect the people caught in the crossfire. Alexis resisted at first, her instincts fighting between loyalty, fear, and the moral compass she had spent years trying to rebuild. But Jason saw the hesitation, and in that hesitation he saw confirmation she knew something devastating, something that would alter everything he believed about the poisoning, about Willow, and about the depths of manipulation trapping Drew Kane inside a psychological prison he couldn't claw his way out of. The adjustment Jason forced upon Alexis, his insistence that she confess what she had learned, became the turning point, in a situation already teetering on collapse. Alexis finally admitted fragments of information she had been piecing together, inconsistencies in reports, discrepancies in timing, and a pattern of emotional deterioration in Drew that pointed less toward random trauma and more toward deliberate manipulation. The truth she revealed was not complete, not polished, but sharp enough to cut through the fog surrounding Jason's investigation. And with every word she spoke, Jason realized that Drew was not simply poisoned physically. He was being cornered, mentally pushed toward a self-created isolation where he questioned his instincts, doubted his worth, and retreated into a prison of the mind, one that someone close to him had carefully constructed. That someone was Willow Tate. Jason had suspected her, but Alexis's reluctant confession solidified what had only been intuition. Willow had become the silent architect of Drew's unraveling, not necessarily through malice, but through a warped sense of righteousness or fear that had driven her to confine him emotionally, to reinforce his doubts, to trap him in a cycle of guilt and self-blame. It was not physical chains that held Drew captive. It was Willow's influence, her subtle pressure, her insistence that he withdraw, reflect, isolate. Drew no longer trusted the people around him. He no longer trusted himself. And Jason understood with stomach-turning clarity that psychological captivity was far more dangerous than any locked. Jason felt something inside him ignite a furious, protective force that had nothing to do with past brotherly affection and everything to do with the injustice unfolding in front of him. Drew was being broken from the inside out. Someone had built a cage out of emotional manipulation, and Willow had become its keeper, whether intentional or coerced. She was driving Drew deeper into a state where he could no longer distinguish truth from fear. And if Jason did not intervene soon, Drew would lose himself entirely. The need to rescue his brother sharpened Jason's focus into something nearly primal. He would not allow Drew to crumble under the weight of someone else's lies. He would not allow Willow's instability or her hidden motives to poison the last fragments of Drew's identity. And he would certainly not allow the chaos surrounding the Quartermain legacy to escalate into the disaster it was, quickly becoming... because the Quartermain family, in all its power and dysfunction, had become collateral damage in Willow's unraveling. Drew's behavior had already rippled outward, threatening business decisions, family alliances, and emotional stability. Jason could see the madness spreading, an invisible infection undermining one of the most influential families in Port. Chards, And the terrifying truth was that all of it traced back to a woman who appeared gentle on the surface, yet carried enough emotional volatility to destroy everything in her wake. Jason knew the situation was spiraling into something unrecognizable. Alexis's confession had only confirmed the scale of the disaster forming beneath the surface, one that combined manipulation, mental collapse, and the terrifying realization that Willow was far more unstable than anyone dared admit. Jason now saw the future clearly if he didn't break Willow's hold over Drew. The Quartermain family would fall into chaos, Drew would lose himself completely, and the poisoning would become only the first step in a chain reaction of devastation. The adjustments were already happening. Jason had shifted from suspicion to certainty. Drew had shifted from confusion to collapse. Willow had shifted from fragile to dangerous. Port Charles itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would finally snap. Jason refused to let that moment come. He would rip Drew out of the psychological cage Willow built. He would confront the truth Alexis had feared to speak. He would face the storm that had already begun swallowing the Quartermains. Because protecting Drew was no longer a choice. It had become the only thing holding back a catastrophe. The moment Jason realized the magnitude of the psychological collapse unfolding around Drew Kane, he understood that the damage was no longer confined to one man's suffering. The ripple effect had reached the children innocent vulnerable, and deeply entangled in the emotional chaos that Drew's deterioration and Willow's unraveling had created. Jason had been patient for as long as he could. He had observed quietly, calculated carefully, and waited for the right moment to intervene. But the more Drew sank into isolation, the more Jason saw the danger expanding outward toward the people he loved most, Danny, Morgan, and Scout Kane. Their emotional well-being, their stability, and their entire sense of safety were beginning to fracture under the weight of adult turmoil they could not possibly understand. And when Jason saw that something inside him crystallized, the adjustments he had been contemplating became decisions. The decisions became actions, and the actions became the beginning of a transformation none of them were prepared for. Jason knew he had to secure the children before the chaos swallowed them too. Drew's collapse had reached a point where guardianship was no longer a theoretical concern, it was an emergency. Willow, spiraling deeper into her unstable and destructive patterns, had become incapable of providing emotional grounding for herself, much less two children connected to Drew's already fragile psyche. Jason recognized that the Quartermain household was on the brink of becoming a battlefield, and Danny and Scout were standing in the crossfire, unaware of how quickly their world could crumble. So he made a decision that would redefine everything he would petition for the restoration of guardianship, not to keep for himself, but to transfer it to the one person who could protect them while he fought to save Drew. That person was Alexis Davis. Jason's trust in Alexis was not based on sentimentality, but on the unshakable knowledge that she acted with integrity when the stakes were highest. Alexis had the emotional discipline, the legal clarity, and the moral backbone to care for Danny and Scout without letting chaos steer her decisions. She saw the truth even when others refused to acknowledge it. She recognized danger long before it erupted. And despite her own complicated history, Alexis possessed the steady presence necessary to anchor the children through what was coming. By granting her guardianship, Jason was not relinquishing responsibility. He was fortifying the line of defense around two young lives before the storm intensified. But the shock of this adjustment, Jason asserting legal control and bypassing Willow, entirely sent a tremor through Port Charles. It signaled a shift in power, but more importantly, it signaled Jason's silent declaration that Willow's influence was no longer safe. It exposed the truth that no one wanted to speak. Willow's emotional instability had reached a point where she posed a direct risk, not only to Drew, but to anyone connected to him. The future she had feared was no longer approaching. It was already at her doorstep, and it was darker than anything she imagined. Jason's maneuver forced the town to confront what he already knew, that Willow was unraveling under pressures no one fully understood, and her proximity to the children could not continue unchecked. Meanwhile, Drew's situation deteriorated further. He was slipping into a state where mental captivity felt more binding than any physical restraint. The guilt, confusion, and emotional manipulation Willow had woven around him created a psychological labyrinth with no clear exit. Jason could see the signs Drew withdrawing from familiar faces, losing the ability to distinguish support from threat, doubting even the intentions of those who had fought for him relentlessly. He was collapsing piece by piece, and if Jason didn't intervene soon, Drew might lose himself permanently. Saving him had become a race against time. The decision to transfer guardianship was not a betrayal of Drew, it was an act of protection. Jason saw that the children needed distance from the implosion happening within their father, otherwise they would carry the trauma of his collapse for the rest of their lives. Alexis, with her grounded wisdom and unwavering sense of responsibility, became the safeguard Jason needed to put in place before he confronted the heart of the disaster. But perhaps the darkest shift of all was the realization that Willow's future was no longer merely uncertain, catastrophic. Her involvement in Drew's poisoning, whether intentional or manipulated, had created a stain she could not wash away. The instability growing inside her, the lies she whispered to protect herself, the emotional trap she built around Drew, all of it was spiraling toward a consequence she could not escape. Jason saw the truth forming long before Willow did. Her world was closing in, each secret forming a link in the chain that was pulling her toward a downfall both public and devastating. Once the guardianship shifted, once Alexis took control, once the Quartermain family recognized how compromised Willow had become, there would be no path for her to return to the life she once had. And Jason, standing at the center of it all, felt the weight of every decision pressing against him. He was not simply protecting the children. He was realigning the trajectory of an entire family. He was uprooting darkness that had been allowed to grow unchecked. He was preparing to rescue Drew from a psychological abyss. And he was forcing Willow to face the consequences of her unraveling, even if she still believed she could outrun them. The adjustments Jason set into motion were irreversible. They signaled the beginning of a new chapter, one carved out of necessity, sharpened by truth, and fueled by the fierce instinct to protect what remained unbroken. Danny and Scout would be safe. Alexis would provide the stability they needed. Drew would have a chance at survival. And Willow, for the first time, would be forced to confront the darkness she had spent months pretending did not exist. The future was no longer uncertain. It was unfolding, and it was about to change all of them forever.